How John G. Lake resurrected a baby and conquered death. The story you were never supposed to hear. What if I told you there was a story hidden in the shadows of history? A story so powerful, so unexplained, that even seasoned doctors were left speechless. And science simply had no answer. This isn't fiction, this isn't legend. This is the true account of a 9-month-old baby girl who died and came back to life, pronounced dead. Body sent to the morgue. And then something happened that changed everything. This is the story of Agnes Young and the man whose faith shook the walls of death itself, John G. Lake. But listen closely, this isn't just a miracle to be admired. It's a testimony that might just challenge the way you see the world, your faith, and what's truly possible when heaven touches earth. Before we dive in, if you're passionate about real, raw, miraculous stories that defy the impossible, hit that subscribe button now. Leave a comment telling us, do you believe miracles still happen today? And if this story moves you, share it. You might be the reason someone else finds hope. Now, take a deep breath, because once you hear what happened in Spokane that day, you'll never look at death the same way again. An invitation to the impossible. Imagine witnessing something with your own eyes that defies all logic, something that science cannot explain. Imagine seeing a life return from the absolute silence of death through the power of prayer alone. This isn't fiction. These are real, documented testimonies that forever mark the trajectory of a city and thousands of lives around the world. In this story, you will be guided through extraordinary accounts of radical faith where the invisible becomes tangible and where death does not have the final word. Among the miracles that occurred under the ministry of the Apostle of Divine Healing, John G. Lake, one stands out with indescribable force: the resurrection of Agnes Young. Agnes Young, a baby declared dead by healthcare professionals, a body taken to the cold room where destiny seemed sealed. But God had other plans. Prepare to feel, to be moved, and to reflect. Because what you are about to hear might change how you view life, faith, and the impossible. The silence that cried out for a miracle. Spokane, 1916. The flu and other debilitating diseases were weakening entire families. Hospitals, despite the efforts of doctors, could not contain the growing wave of deaths. The winter of that year had been cruel. Streets blanketed with snow masked the sadness that plagued the city. Cemeteries were overworked, and funeral bells had become a constant soundtrack. It was in this atmosphere that whispers began to circulate about a preacher who not only spoke about faith, but demonstrated a power that seemed to come from another dimension. This man was John Graham Lake, a South African businessman who had abandoned his career to dedicate his life to divine healing. At the center of the pain stood a refuge called the Healing Rooms, founded by John G. Lake. There, people gathered not only for healing, but for a chance to believe again. The Healing Rooms operated in a humble building in downtown Spokane, its white walls adorned only with Bible verses about healing and restoration. Lake's team was composed of men and women trained in the Word and intercession. They fasted regularly, prayed for hours, and lived lives of holiness. Lake believed that divine healing was not a spectacle, but a manifestation of God's love, requiring preparation and purity of heart. Each day began at 7 a.m. with prayer. Then the doors opened, and lines formed regardless of weather. People traveled long distances, bringing their sick loved ones on stretchers. And on one of those grey days, Thomas and Margaret Young arrived at Deaconess Hospital, carrying what remained of their hope, their baby daughter, Agnes. Agnes was 9 months old. Her body weighed less than 4 pounds. Her eyes were closed, and her chest no longer moved. The illness had come suddenly, a fever that didn't subside. Dr. Harrison diagnosed pneumonia, but treatments failed. Agnes died in Margaret's arms early Tuesday morning. Doctors confirmed the death. The death certificate was signed at 6:47 a.m. with the cause listed as acute pneumonia with respiratory complications. A nurse followed procedure and moved Agnes to the dead room, a cold, windowless basement chamber designed to preserve bodies. Margaret collapsed in the hallway, crying out to God. Thomas held a handkerchief Margaret had embroidered during pregnancy, pressing it to his chest like a last link to his daughter. As grief overwhelmed them, Martha Reynolds, an elderly visitor at the hospital, approached them. Martha was known for her unwavering faith and connection to John G. Lake's healing rooms. She had witnessed miracles and told the couple, "Don't give up yet. There's a man of God who has authority over death. Let me send for him." The arrival of the impossible one of Lake's trained ministers, Reverend Samuel Morrison, was urgently called. A former military officer, Morrison had personally experienced divine healing and was now a committed man of prayer and fasting. When he received the call, he left immediately for the hospital. Upon meeting the devastated Youngs, Morrison didn't offer empty consolation. "Where is the child?" he asked. Learning she had been moved to the dead room, he insisted on being taken there. Head nurse Mrs. Patterson protested, reminding him the child had been dead for hours. But something in Morrison's demeanor silenced objections. Down in the cold chamber, Morrison approached the child's lifeless body. He gently lifted her into his arms and began to pray. Softly at first, then with increasing authority. He prayed in English, in tongues, quoting scriptures of resurrection, invoking Jesus' name with boldness. This was no ritual. It was spiritual warfare. Morrison recalled a vision from months earlier during a fast, a vision of a child being raised from the dead. Now it made sense. He prayed on, despite 30 minutes passing with no visible change. Mrs. Patterson and other staff watched from the doorway, uncomfortable but unable to look away. Morrison remained focused. "Lord Jesus," he cried, "you said the dead would hear your voice and live. Speak to Agnes now. Command life to return." Then, a tremor, barely perceptible. Morrison paused. Then he saw it. A faint sigh, then another. The baby's chest began to rise and fall, weakly but steadily. Her color began to return. Her eyelids fluttered and opened. Agnes was breathing. Mrs. Patterson felt her knees give way. She had worked there 30 years. She knew death. But what she saw defied all logic. A medical shock and city-wide stir. Within minutes, the miracle had drawn attention across the hospital floor. Nurses gathered near the stairwell. Doctors were called urgently. First came Dr. Harrison, the physician who had signed Agnes's death certificate earlier that morning. Upon entering the cold chamber, he froze. His own handwriting on the paperwork said the child had expired. Yet now, here she was, alive, breathing, slowly warming up in Morrison's arms. He didn't say a word for nearly a minute. He simply knelt beside the minister and examined Agnes. He placed a stethoscope against her tiny chest and listened. Her heartbeat was faint, but real. The lungs, once still, now moved rhythmically. There were no signs of trauma, no neurological dysfunction, no stiffness, no discoloration. "This is impossible," he whispered. Dr. Foster and Dr. Mitchell were summoned next. Both had reputations as competent, even skeptical men of science. They performed their own exams, rechecked vitals, confirmed the previous declaration of death. But now, with Agnes showing stable responses, none could offer any explanation. The hospital required a formal report. Dr. Harrison documented the timeline precisely. The time of death, the transfer to the morgue, the visual confirmation, the minister's arrival, and the spontaneous return of life. "Unexplainable by current medical understanding," he wrote. "Spontaneous resumption of vital function with no apparent damage." News spread fast, far faster than anyone could control. A nurse told the janitor, who told a priest, who mentioned it to a local baker. By mid-afternoon, customers at stores and pharmacies were asking the same question. Did you hear about the baby at Deaconess? Within 24 hours, dozens had gathered outside the hospital just to catch a glimpse of Agnes's room window. Newspapers caught wind of the story. A journalist from the Spokane Chronicle visited the healing rooms, requesting an interview with John G. Lake. Lake, composed and direct, responded, "The Lord Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. What happened to that child is available to any who believe." By the third day, Agnes had fully stabilized. She was transferred out of isolation and into the arms of her weeping parents. Margaret whispered lullabies again, not of mourning, but of thanksgiving. Nurses who had been present in the morgue now volunteered for double shifts just to witness her recovery. Some had quietly mocked Lake's ministry in the past. Now they watched with wide eyes as the impossible became daily routine. One young nurse, Jennifer, reportedly rededicated her life to God after seeing Agnes alive. Another, a war veteran turned orderly, requested to visit the healing rooms for prayer. The miracle had not only raised a child, it was awakening a city. Dr. Harrison was deeply affected. He had seen hundreds die. He'd fought in epidemics, but nothing had prepared him for this. Over the following weeks, he would refer 3 other patients to Lake's healing rooms, not because he doubted medicine, but because he now understood its limits. Agnes remained at the hospital under observation for 1 full week. Each day, doctors ran tests, reflexes, cognition, breathing, blood circulation, all came back normal. On the 6th day, she began to giggle when touched under the chin. On the 7th, she stood briefly on her mother's lap. On Sunday, she was discharged. The young family returned to their modest home, changed forever. Thomas returned to work, but something in his demeanor had shifted. He prayed before meals now, something he had rarely done before. Margaret became a frequent visitor at the healing rooms, praying for other mothers and sharing her testimony with any who would listen. And people listened. The Sunday following Agnes's release, the healing rooms saw a line stretch around the block. People who had once scoffed now arrived with curiosity and desperation. Families came from Oregon, Idaho, and Canada. They brought photographs, letters, even ashes, hoping for a miracle. Lake didn't capitalize on the attention. He didn't publish books or start a fundraising campaign. He preached, he trained, he prayed. And he made one thing clear. This is not about a man. It's about God's power made manifest in those who believe without compromise. The healing rooms were now open 6 days a week. By late January, appointments were necessary. Morrison, the minister who had prayed for Agnes, was now leading 2 prayer teams full-time. Others were raised up and sent to new cities. The revival was organic. It wasn't driven by advertising, celebrity, or hype. It was hunger. It was faith. It was the unmistakable presence of something beyond logic, something holy. By March, the Spokane Tribune ran a headline, "Death Reversed, Hospital Confirms Revival of Infant After Pronounced Dead." The article quoted Dr. Mitchell, who admitted, "I have no explanation. As a man of science, I call it spontaneous return of vital functions. As a man with a soul, I call it a miracle." Even skeptics softened. Local clergy who had once warned their congregations to avoid Lake's ministry now visited incognito. Some brought sick relatives, others asked for prayer. Still, not everyone rejoiced. The Washington Medical Board began an informal inquiry. A few physicians accused the healing rooms of emotional manipulation or encouraging hallucination. But when presented with Agnes's full medical file, before, during, and after, the evidence left little room for denial. The baby who had once been cold and breathless was now laughing and crawling. The miracle had names, signatures, timestamps. It could not be erased. And Agnes Young? She would grow up with no memory of the day she returned from the dead, but with a life that never stopped reminding others that God still moves. The movement ignites. The story of Agnes Young's resurrection continued to spread beyond Spokane. In churches, barbershops, schoolrooms, and train stations, strangers would lean in and whisper, "Did you hear about the baby who came back from the dead?" For many, it wasn't just news. It was hope reborn. It was proof that the boundaries of reality weren't as fixed as they'd thought. By April of that year, reports had reached Seattle, Portland, and even as far as San Francisco. Letters poured into the healing rooms from all over the country. Some requested prayer, others sent testimonies. A few were skeptical, but the majority were desperate. "If God did it for her, maybe he can do it for my son," one letter read. Another simply said, "Please, come to our town." John G. Lake never sought fame. In fact, he resisted it. While many encouraged him to publish the full account, to capitalize on the miracle, Lake chose humility. "Let the fruit speak for itself," he often said. But he did see the importance of stewardship. A formal documentation process was implemented at the healing rooms. Every healing was recorded, including name, diagnosis, medical verification, and follow-up. Agnes Young's case became File 1001R, where R stood for resurrection. The folder included her original death certificate, the hospital's incident report, and signed statements from 3 doctors. Over time, more folders were added. Cases of cancer healed, paralysis reversed, blind eyes opened, but none carried the weight of Agnes's story. The healing rooms evolved. They were no longer just a room and a prayer circle. They became a hub of training, equipping, and commissioning. Lake's team developed a training manual for ministers, emphasizing holiness, prayer, discernment, and radical obedience. Those who completed the course were released to open their own healing centers. Spokane wasn't just experiencing revival, it was exporting it. By summer, there were healing rooms in 5 additional cities. The testimonies multiplied. A woman in Idaho rose from her wheelchair. A boy in Portland, born deaf, began speaking after a short prayer. The reports mirrored the intensity of the early church in the Book of Acts, but central to every sermon, every conversation, was the story of the little girl who came back. Church attendance in Spokane doubled in less than a year. Denominations that previously didn't agree began hosting joint prayer nights. Police reported a notable drop in crime. Even saloon owners confessed that their traffic had declined. Something invisible had shifted. Lake remained grounded. "This isn't revival because of me," he told a local reporter. "It's revival because a people decided to believe and refused to compromise." He emphasized personal holiness as the key. It's not just about power, it's about purity. The Holy Spirit will not dwell in a vessel that's halfway surrendered. His messages cut deep. He didn't just talk about healing, he spoke against gossip, greed, pride, and lukewarm faith. Meanwhile, Agnes Young was thriving. Her development was not only normal, it was accelerated. By age 1, she was walking. By age 2, she could quote full scriptures. Nurses and family members testified that she carried a strange peace about her. "She looks at you like she already knows something you don't," one said. Margaret Young, once overwhelmed with grief, became a radiant voice of faith. She began ministering to mothers in the community, especially those who had lost children. She never glorified herself, only God. "I had nothing left," she often shared, "but he gave me everything back and more." Agnes's story also attracted the attention of researchers. One professor from Chicago University requested to interview the family. He wasn't a believer. He called himself a historian of phenomena. After a week in Spokane, interviewing doctors, reviewing medical charts, and watching Agnes himself, he left with only one sentence in his notebook. There are things we simply don't understand. Lake warned his team about pride. The moment we start seeking the miracle instead of the man behind it, we'll lose the presence. And without presence, we're nothing but noise. He encouraged weekly fasting, daily repentance, and constant worship. As the healing rooms expanded, persecution increased. Articles began appearing in opposing newspapers. Words like hoax, emotion-driven hysteria, and faith exploitation began to surface. But Lake didn't respond publicly. He told his staff, "The enemy always barks louder when the gates of hell are being shaken." Agnes, unaware of the controversy surrounding her, continued to live a quiet childhood. She had a fondness for music and flowers. At age 6, she told her Sunday school teacher that she wanted to grow up and help God heal broken people. The room fell silent. The teacher, fighting back tears, simply nodded. As new centers opened across the country, Lake began delegating more. He spent time discipling younger leaders, not in power, but in character. Power can be borrowed, he taught, but character is forged. By 1920, over 100,000 people had visited the healing rooms in Spokane. Of those, more than 80,000 reported measurable improvement or complete healing. The records were audited, verified by independent parties, and compiled into what became known as the Lake Healing Archives. Agnes's story, however, remained the crown jewel of those archives. Science, skepticism, and the evidence of wonder. By the early 1920s, the story of Agnes Young was no longer confined to church circles or local headlines. It had become a case study. Researchers, journalists, and theologians began examining the documentation surrounding her death and return. Though many entered the inquiry with skepticism, few left unchanged. One notable figure was Dr. Leonard Bristow, a Harvard-educated physician who had built his career on rationalism and evidence-based medicine. He was invited by a colleague in Washington to review the files personally. Bristow spent 3 days in Spokane. He interviewed the doctors who had signed Agnes's death certificate. He examined the original documents. He reviewed the timeline, the gap between the time of death and spontaneous revival. He studied the child's development post-revival. In his final statement, Bristow wrote, "While I maintain my commitment to medical science, I cannot deny that something occurred in this case that contradicts all known biological principles. There is no logical explanation." Agnes's case began appearing in academic journals under sections titled "Unexplained Phenomena." Some authors used terms like psychosomatic revival or misdiagnosed clinical death. But none could explain how a body left in cold storage for over 2 hours could resume life without any physiological consequences. No brain damage, no muscular stiffness, no trauma. Even more striking was Agnes's progress. As she grew older, her health remained exceptional. She never experienced respiratory illness again. Her immune system, according to physicians, was unusually strong. Teachers described her as emotionally mature beyond her age, often calm in moments of chaos. She carried peace like a fragrance, one noted. At age 9, Agnes was asked by a newspaper reporter if she remembered the moment she died. She paused, smiled, and simply replied, "No, but I know I came back for something." In private, John G. Lake and his team treated the event with profound reverence. They never turned Agnes into a symbol or celebrity. In fact, they often shielded her from media. "This is not a circus," Lake told his staff. "God does not perform for cameras." That philosophy was central to Lake's ministry. He avoided spectacle. His services were orderly, focused, deeply prayerful. Testimonies were shared, but always followed by extended moments of thanksgiving and humility. "We don't chase signs," he would say. "We chase the one who gives them." Opposition continued. A group of physicians filed a formal request for investigation with the Washington State Medical Board. a hearing was scheduled and Lake was called to testify. He brought with him a team of doctors, the very ones who had confirmed Agnes's death and observed her recovery. The hearing lasted 6 hours. Medical records were submitted. Witnesses testified under oath. At the end, the board concluded, "While we cannot endorse theological interpretations, the facts of the case do not show any fraud, malpractice, or falsification. This board closes its inquiry with no disciplinary recommendations." The verdict emboldened the healing rooms. New ministers came forward. Nurses, doctors, and even skeptics now volunteered at the facility. The city government recognized the ministry's contribution to public health, stating that the emotional and physical well-being of Spokane residents had improved measurably since the ministry's expansion. And through it all, Agnes grew. As a teenager, she joined the Healing Room's prayer team, not because of her past, but because of her present passion. She prayed quietly, often unnoticed, but with precision and authority. "She didn't need volume," said one team member. "When Agnes prayed, things shifted." At age 17, Agnes enrolled in a local nursing program. She had a keen interest in pediatric care, especially with infants who had respiratory conditions. Her instructors quickly realized she was different. She treated medicine as sacred and patients as priceless. One professor wrote, "She does not study to pass exams. She studies to restore life." While others focused on diagnosis, Agnes often lingered at the bedside, praying silently, sometimes placing a gentle hand on a child's chest. No one ever questioned her presence. In fact, many families requested her by name. Around that time, she began journaling. Her writings revealed a young woman of deep reflection and purpose. In one entry, she wrote, "I do not remember dying, but I live every day as someone borrowed from eternity." At age 23, Agnes married Daniel Miles, a local chaplain's son who had served as a medic during the war. He had heard her story as a teenager, but never imagined they'd meet. Their bond was rooted in shared purpose. Together, they opened a small clinic focused on holistic care, treating both body and soul. They had 3 children, all of whom carried the same spirit of compassion and faith. The young Miles household became known as a place of healing, where people came not only for physical care, but for peace. Lake, now older, continued to visit the family occasionally. He never spoke much during those visits. He simply observed, smiled, and once whispered to Agnes, "You are the seed that broke Spokane's soil." As the years passed, the original healing room slowed in pace. New leaders took over, the archives were preserved, and Agnes's file remained at the top, a reminder of what happens when heaven touches earth. Legacy written in eternity, 1,500 words. The demand for prayer and healing quickly overwhelmed the original healing room's facilities. Lake responded by renting adjacent buildings and training more ministers to meet the growing flow of the sick and desperate. He established a rotating schedule that operated from dawn until late into the night. Each shift began with collective prayer and worship, followed by personal ministry sessions that could last from a few minutes to several hours, depending on the intensity of the case. The economic impact on Spokane was undeniable. Hotels overflowed with visitors from neighboring towns and distant states. Local restaurants had waiting lines. The city's railway stations reported a sharp increase in traffic. It was as if the entire city had transformed into a spiritual epicenter. Word of mouth alone had turned Spokane into a place of pilgrimage, and at the center of that movement was a child who once lay cold and lifeless. As time passed, other cases began to emerge, extraordinary healings that defied explanation. People on the brink of death who walked away days later after sincere prayer. These weren't only cases of influenza or pneumonia. There were testimonies of cancer disappearing, of blind eyes opened, of bones straightening instantly, and yes, of others raised from the dead. Each testimony was carefully documented. Lake's team became methodical. Each file had names, addresses, attending physicians, and written witness reports. Independent notaries often verified the most dramatic cases. By 1924, over 100,000 prayer sessions had been conducted in Spokane's healing rooms. According to the archives, 80% of the individuals reported full or measurable healing. Agnes's file remained unmatched in emotional weight. Her name became synonymous with revival. In some circles, she was simply called the Resurrection Girl. But her family refused to exploit the miracle. They lived humbly, avoiding the spotlight. Agnes herself, even in adulthood, rarely spoke of that day unless prompted. "I don't remember dying," she often said, "but I remember living, and I do it with purpose." She became a nurse, serving in both children's hospitals and home care. Her touch was often requested. Patients noted that her presence calmed them, even before treatment began. Colleagues said she rarely rushed and always prayed silently before entering a room. Her husband, Daniel, remained her partner in ministry and medicine. Together, they served communities others overlooked, rural areas, migrant camps, even prisons. Meanwhile, John G. Lake expanded his reach beyond Spokane. He launched healing ministries in Portland, San Diego, and even overseas. He trained hundreds of divine technicians, ministers who were as disciplined as they were anointed. Each graduate committed to daily prayer, moral purity, and service to the sick without charge. "Freely you received," Lake would say, "freely give." By the late 1920s, Lake's impact had become international. Churches modeled after the healing rooms appeared in Canada, South Africa, and even Latin America. Missionaries carried translated testimonies of Agnes's resurrection into regions where Western medicine hadn't yet reached. In some villages, children were named Agnes in her honor, not because they had met her, but because her story gave them faith. Academic institutions could no longer ignore the movement. Seminaries offered elective courses on divine healing. Medical schools used Lake's records as case studies on psychosomatic influence and the mind-body connection. A few skeptics persisted, but even they were forced to admit that something unexplainable had taken place in Spokane, and that its ripple effects were global. Agnes, in her later years, continued her work quietly. She opened a small children's hospice facility where she served until her 70s. Every child received not only medical care, but also prayer. Some recovered, others didn't, but all were loved deeply. Her children grew up hearing her story, not as folklore, but as family history. Her grandchildren memorized Psalm 91 before they could read. The youngest, Caleb, once said, "If Grandma died and came back, then I think Jesus can do anything." That simple faith, passed down like an heirloom, was her true inheritance. In 1965, on the 50th anniversary of Agnes's resurrection, a private commemorative gathering was held at the site of the original healing rooms. The building had been repurposed, but the atmosphere remained reverent. Doctors, ministers, and former patients attended. Agnes sat quietly, now in her late 50s, and listened as others told the story that had defined so many lives, yet never defined her identity. She took the microphone only once. "I was given back," she said, "not to be admired, but to be useful. Don't let a miracle become a monument, let it become movement." John G. Lake passed away in 1935, but his work lived on. Ministries bearing his name continued in multiple countries. His writings, preserved carefully by disciples, were published posthumously and studied by new generations of healing evangelists. Today, the legacy remains. The modern healing rooms movement, revived in the 1990s and inspired by Lake's original model, operates in over 80 countries. Their emphasis remains on prayer, purity, and presence, exactly as Lake intended. Each room is a place not of superstition, but of surrender. Agnes Young lived a long life. She passed away peacefully in 2005 at the age of 89, surrounded by family, her Bible open beside her. Her final words, as recalled by her daughter, were simple. "He gave me life, twice. I gave him everything." Her obituary didn't mention the word miracle. It listed her roles: nurse, mother, wife, servant. And perhaps that was the greatest testimony of all, that a miracle doesn't have to become a spectacle to matter. Sometimes the most powerful wonders are the ones that lead to quiet lives of faithfulness. Spokane remembers. The city that once echoed with grief now carries a different history, not just of one child brought back to life, but of thousands brought back to hope. The story of Agnes Young is more than a tale of resurrection. It's a declaration that death never has the final word, and that when faith rises, even the grave must bow. Death lost that day. What happened to Agnes Young wasn't just a miracle. It was a warning shot to death itself, that it doesn't get the final word. It was a reminder that no matter how dark the moment, no matter how lifeless the room, faith still breathes. And maybe the most powerful part? John G. Lake didn't seek glory. Agnes never chased fame. And yet, their story continues to echo across generations, because it's not just about one baby who came back. It's about what happens when ordinary people refuse to stop believing. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Share it with someone who needs hope. Drop a comment and tell us, what would you ask God for if you truly believed nothing was impossible? And if you want more stories like this, real, raw, and faith-filled, subscribe now and join a movement of people who still believe in miracles, because death lost that day, and every time a story like this is told, it loses again.